disorder having broken out.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Praxis TV. And today I'm really delighted to be welcoming Chris Fairley, based in Luton, I think, and founder of Britain Has Class, and also involved in lots of other projects as well. So Chris currently works for the Sheila McKechnie Foundation, but that's a fairly recent appointment, I understand. And Sheila McKechnie Foundation specialises in training campaigners in creating change, which sounds really fascinating. He's previously worked as a researcher at Hope Not Hate, looking at the vulnerability to the far right in English and Welsh towns. Wrote Loss on the Terraces about football and community, which is really topical at the moment, given all of the furore over the Super League issue. Runs a campaign called In Your Corner, which is related to protecting statutory advocacy as a human rights safeguard. Has an activist focus in organising in relation to class and mental health, class and democratic inclusion and political engagement, and anti-fascism and anti-poverty. Is the founder of Britain Has Class, as I've mentioned, is the director of the New Economy Organisers Network, and is an amateur carpenter. That's a hell of a... How the hell? How do you do all that?
Just a very quick question. I'm not the director of the New Economy Organisers Network. I'm just one of their one of their trustees.
Okay.
My job is to get sued if they get sued.
Great. Noted.
Work, that I can't take any credit for. It's... I suppose like all working class activists do. I just don't have a life.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's like we were saying just a minute ago, there's so much that needs doing. There's so much that hasn't been done on class, for so long, that it's kind of a question of getting stuck in. And once you get stuck into one thing, you think of other ideas and other things that need doing, and it kind of snowballs from there, doesn't it? So
that's the thing. It's just such a massive fight, isn't it?
It is.
There's nothing that's not relevant.
Yeah.
Unfortunately. But yeah, thanks for having me. It's great, really great to be here.
Oh, thank you. So my first question, as always, to you is: are you working class, and how would you define it? How come you're working class and not middle class?
I suppose by this point I have to be working class, otherwise I've wasted all my time. So, I think I'm working class. I think I expect a lot of other people to say that I'm not, because what Britain Has Class was founded as is a kind of rejection of social mobility. So I was raised in a working class family in a working class neighborhood in Luton. I went to relatively rundown comprehensive schools. I worked in a warehouse to pay my way through my education. And it's like, very much like if you see a Guardian article about like working class white boys are being left behind, like they should slap a picture of someone who looks like me up there. I've always defined myself as working class. What makes me not middle class has been a question I've been kind of struggling with for the last couple of years. Because I have this very political conception of myself that was instilled to me by a trade unionist family. My dad and my dad's dad and my dad's dad's dad are all working class trade unionists, and I was raised as a working class trade unionist. But now I eat hummus and use words like effervescent and stuff, which is like, it wasn't what I was raised to understand class as, because I was always raised with this kind of like, whip it in flat cap conception of class. But to me, increasingly, what defines me as working class as opposed to middle class is my relationship to power. So fundamentally, I am one of the majority of the people in this country who can be easily ignored by the system because I don't have any influence on it. My relationship to power and money is such that I am purely a commodity in British capitalism, right? I'm a thing to be worked and to be sold, and that's it, really. I work, otherwise I die. And my relationship, like the quality of my life and whether my life exists at all, is dependent entirely on my boss or my relationship with like the Department of Work and Pensions, right? And that's what I think separates me out as working class is, after the sort of cultural conception of myself as, a Lutonian through and through, and a working class lad who done good or whatever. More importantly, it's the political sense that I can be and regularly am just entirely ignored by the system. I think that's what separates it.
So what did that to you in terms of your vocabulary and using words like effervescence and things like that? Was that going to university that changed that? How you? Yeah.
So I was one of the I think I went to Luton Sixth Form College, and in that we had a group of like 14 students who were like coached by the teachers to go on to like fancy unis, and I was lucky enough to be one of them, just pure chance. And I went on to the London School of Economics, which is where Britain as Class was founded. Because when we went on to LSE, and so Britain as Class is a founding team of about 6 or 7 that then went on to be like a group of like 20 or 30 students who had this idea that, you know, we've been working class all our lives. We've never been anything other than working class. We've never even conceived of the idea that we'd be anything other than working class. But then all of a sudden, we get good enough grades in sixth form, just by pure like statistical chance. Like a certain amount of kids in every school are going to get A's and A stars, right? And by that statistical chance, we go on to a posh uni, and then all of a sudden we are isolated from both our working class communities and roots, but also we're never going to be fully middle class. Like we're fully isolated from that that university as an institution and the middle class people there. But the idea is that we should try and cling to that by forgetting about where we came from and where we were and who we are basically overnight, right? So Britain as Class was very much founded as like a rejection of like the idea of Thatcher's children or of like social mobility, you know, the idea that just because you go on to higher education doesn't mean that you should all of a sudden stop giving a toss about all the people that you grew up with and you know who you were before that. Which I think is increasingly relevant. I mean, you know, more than half of 18-year-olds in England now are expected to have a university education by the time they're 30. And if we're thinking of like working class as a political conception, as like a mass politics, then you, like excluding more than half of the people from that mass politics means we're never going to get anything done fundamentally.
Did you? But I found, I don't know if you found, but when I did become more surrounded by middle class people, it did take a while for me to kind of work out. Oh right, okay, so they have that behind them, they have that backing, they have that support, they've had that, you know, private tutoring or whatever it is that's kind of set them up in a different position, and that's going to, you know, affect the trajectory of their life and their earnings ongoing in a different way than someone who's from a working class background. But it takes a while. Did you find a similar thing? Is that how it was for you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it was CLASS, like the Centre for Labour and Social Studies, who did a really good research piece where they found that it was like people who went to comprehensives made about 75% as much as people who went to private school, even after getting the exact same tertiary education. And I found, especially with Britain as Class's position where we're a majority youth organisation, and I'm still a young person myself, technically. A lot of the things that define materially class are also things that a lot of middle class people go through in their youth anyway, right? Like they'll move out of posh homes and they will be private renters, you know, working part-time in pubs and whatever, you know, living relatively like low standards of life where like people would, you know, rent a shared house. Like that was, I was in uni and I was renting a shared house with my friends, and like, you know, we were all eating just like cheap junk food and all working loads of hours to like afford to go out and stuff, or just afford anything really. And then after a couple of months, you just assume that's how life is, and then you realize that, oh, like this is a phase for you. Like you are going to do this, you're going to slum it with me for a bit, and then you're going to go on and you're going to like inherit a bunch of money, or you're going to get a loan from your granddad to buy a house or something. Whereas, you know, like this is the reality of my life for as long as I can do forwards, right? But I think there's that awkward separation, and then once you realize that, I suppose you have two options really, is to like really dig into it and decide like, actually no, I'm going to stay working class, and I'm going to use the sort of privileges and you know, powers that I've gained by going through what you call like traditional social mobility to fight for the rest of the working class as well. Or you do what you're supposed to do and you just fully jump and you just try and become as middle class as you can, while ignoring the fact that like you're never really going to be at that level. You know, like you can develop, you can get all the money you want. You're never going to have the, you know, the cultural touchstones or the family connections that are going to make you the same as them. Your kids might, if you're lucky, but that's it. If you're a working class person, you go out into higher education, if you're really, really lucky, your kids are going to be the people who look down on you now, right? That's it. That's the best case scenario for you.
It doesn't even normally happen over one generation, does it? It normally takes longer than that if it's going to happen at all. Yeah.
That's the thing. We're seeing as well, like we're going to see a backslide in how socially mobile the country. Well, we're already seeing a backslide in how socially mobile the country is. But there used to be a feasible thing where back in the day, if you went to university on like a scholarship or a sponsorship in like the 80s and 90s, there was still few enough people going to uni that would make a difference. And maybe you would have in just 1 or 2 generations, you would shift social classes. But now the majority of people are going to uni. So you're going to see the fact that the majority of people who go to uni aren't going to get these like high paying professional jobs anymore. You're going to have lots of people going to uni and then immediately going out into, low paid administration or office work. And they're going to remain a part of the working class by and large, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
I think what we're seeing now politically with, how volatile everything is, how angry politics is in Britain at the moment, is a lot of people watching that kind of dream burst.
Yeah.
Like, life, they did everything right that says that life should get better, and life just isn't going to get better.
Especially young people and young working class people as well. And it'd be great if there was more of a narrative around this so that people could make sense of that. It's legitimate to be angry about that. If you're promised social mobility and you're promised that if you get yourself 40 grand in debt to go to university, you're going to have a secure job at the end of it. Maybe be able to invest in a small property, something like that. If that's the dream you're sold and you get yourself in debt and then it becomes apparent that you're only ever going to be working in a call center or, equivalent, you've every right to be angry. And a greater understanding of the class system and how it works and how it's always worked, I think is helpful in that, but I think it's missing, isn't it, for an awful lot of people? I was going to ask you, how did your conversation come about? So when you decided you wanted to set up Britain Has Class, or even when you began conversing about class with other people that are from working class backgrounds at uni, who started that conversation? Was it part of your course that you were studying, or was it other things that triggered that?
Well, unfortunately, I did economics at LSE, which is like the most right-wing course to do at a very right-wing university. So sadly, it wasn't course-based, but I was lucky enough. So I'm queer, right? So at university, I had that support network of the LGBT plus officer, and there was like a formal support network, and they ran groups and sessions for queer students. And a lot of people at those sessions were talking about how alienated they felt at home in like relatively rural places where there was no other queer people, or how scared they felt coming into university. And I just mapped that onto my own experience, going like, I feel this, but like less about my sexuality and more about the fact that like, I have nothing in common with any of you. There must be, like, just statistically, there's like 15,000 people here. Someone else must be working class. Can I have what you guys do for class as well? So I just went and I kept making a fuss at like any student union event and going like, well, I want to organise class. And I still have the trade unionist perspective on this because I was raised as a trade unionist. I've been a member of Unite since I was 16. And I just sort of kept approaching the student union as if they were a trade union, going like, well, you're a representative organisation.
Yeah.
Can we hold on this? And student unions don't work in the same way the trade unions do, unfortunately, but they're still a very responsive part of the union movement. So we just over time started forming these plans to run a campaign to generate a class officer.
Yeah.
And we still, it was rough because you go through the hurdles of trying to convince anyone to talk about class. Like you have to have the same conversation 50 times.
Oh my God. Yeah, you do. Yeah.
We just kept going. I feel alienated here. All the justifications for having all the other officers, which is great, like, LGBT plus officers, disability officers, anti-racism officers, international student officers are all demonstrably really important institutions, like really important people for the communities they represent. So why don't working class students have one? And the only reason that they wouldn't is if you don't think that working class students are here or should be here.
Yeah.
So we kept pushing that. And just as we did that, we started running a campaign to install one. And the university actually said the only way that we'd ever get a working class officer was if we won a mass vote on it, because you have to approve new spending by the majority vote of the union. Which is interesting enough. A lot of the time, the student unions, like the only time they want to fall back on the regular union work of like democracy is when they don't want to do something. So we ended up in this really funny position where we had to convince more than half of an incredibly wealthy sort of cohort of people that they should like invest in the representation of people who are nothing like them. But eventually we managed it, and we just picked up other working class students on the way, and people who, I think you'll have the same with the working class activist network, right? Is that like when you talk to people, every now and then you'll get knocks back, but so many of the people you talk to will come up and go like, yeah, I'm really like, I can't believe no one's done this already. I'd really like to be involved.
It's great. I think people that are affected by the issue, they're so relieved, and well done for doing it, because I know how hard that is. I know how hard it is to have the same walls put up in front of you 50 times, and even like 50 times in every couple of months. It's the same kinds of things that people say. And it's pretty exhausting. It is the one area of equalities that is completely ignored and neglected. And I just think there are huge consequences to that personally for people that are working class and find themselves in middle class environments, but also more broadly, culturally and politically as well. So.
Yeah, it's where you get this, that there's a sense, and I think it's, a lot of the work I was doing with Hope Not Hate kind of reflected this. Not that I can speak on behalf of Hope Not Hate, because I work there anymore. But what I saw a lot of was people in towns across the country who developed this kind of anger, and they were not given a vocabulary for it. And it's decades since anyone had spoken to them from a political perspective. The Labour Party had abandoned these places fundamentally. Like they're Labour strongholds, but the Labour Party, like I worked in Neath Talbot, which is a South Wales steel town, right? And their MP is Stephen Kinnock, who is like the flattest middle class man you've ever seen. And it's just fundamentally very boring, and will never give them a conception of class because he's not interested in it.
Yeah.
So you saw people get increasingly wound up about the idea that they knew they were getting fucked over in some way.
Yeah.
No one was giving them that conception of it. So if you don't do that, that's very volatile, because you develop a powder keg, and then all it takes is the right Tommy Robinson to come along and light it.
Absolutely, right? Yeah.
That's not to let anyone off of involvement in the far right, but it is to say, like, if we want to stop this, we can structurally stop it.
Yeah.
I think it is. You're right in that it's, for some reason, it's even though class is so parallel to all of the other inequalities in society.
Yeah.
It's always been sort of separated out. And like partly by working class activists who like kind of reduce everything else to class, which I don't think we should do, but also more by people who are just uninterested in talking about it. Like we saw, I don't know if you saw, but Just Fair, the charity, just got a big win in Wales, where the Welsh government have finally agreed to fulfil the socio-economic part of the Equalities Act.
Yeah.
Which is fantastic.
It is amazing.
But
yes.
When you saw that news story, and I feel like when most people saw that news story, they were like, right, that hadn't been happening.
Yeah.
That one. Like, you've done all the others, but you just saw that one and went like, actually, no. And like the English government still does it. Like, we just see the fact that like we have to treat everyone equally, and then we get to socioeconomic background, and we just go like,
doesn't matter.
Bit tricky. Don't want to do it.
Yeah. And it's all of the usual arguments, like you can't define it. No one agrees on a definition, and if you allow people to self-define, then people who, this is one of the arguments that's been put to me within the Labour Party, because at the moment we're putting together some rule changes.
Right.
Well, that's something that I've been working on, and trying to convince people who are good left socialists, that this is a worthwhile thing to do, and it's needed. And some of the arguments that I'm getting back are, we don't really agree with that, because we identify as working class just on the basis that we work to live, and anybody who works is working class, and so you'll have anybody who works putting themselves. But the thing is, within politics, less than 3% of Labour MPs, I always say this in every interview that I do, but it's something that just needs repeating, less than 3%. And you're talking about the working class, people that are in sort of low paid, low status, manual or routine labour, say, for example, if you took that, or unemployed, say you take that group of people, that's the group of people that are underrepresented massively in politics, but they make up 30% or more of the population of the UK. It's a huge issue. And you can allow people to self-identify as working class, I think, if you give some kind of guidance as to, we're talking about the people that are left out and invisible. If they're left out and invisible, they qualify under that heading. It's not really any more complicated than that, or it doesn't need to be. But
yeah, I think so. And I think, so much of the conversations I struggle with in class activism is just convincing people that we should do anything. Like, I am not like, I founded Britain as Class, and like, push it as much as I can, just because like there was nothing else. No one was gonna. And I'm probably not the best representative of it. I was a manual worker for 5 years. But increasingly as I get older, I am like not going back into manual work at the moment, and like that part of my life will become smaller and smaller as I get older. If they're right, maybe not. So I am not a great representative, but someone will be. And like just the idea that we should pitch it, and like people will know, like with your question at the start of like, are you working class and why? Is that if you ask anyone who's running for a position to represent working class people, then like an audience will know how sincere they're being. And that's like, I do a lot of work outside of class. Like my two like liberation areas, or whatever you want to call them, are disability, because I have like a history of mental health problems, and sexuality, right? And those aren't like those are represented in the Labour Party with officers. But the lines on the outside of those are incredibly fuzzy as well. Like there are constant arguments within queer communities and disabled communities, like, does someone, like, say, if you want a disabled officer to represent disabled people, do they represent people with physical and mental disabilities as they're classified strictly? Do they represent people with mental health problems? If they represent people with mental health problems, do they represent people with depression and anxiety? Because that's like one in 2 or 3 people, right? And when it comes to sexuality as well, like how do you police the borders of that? And a lot of people just think you shouldn't, and I don't think you should either.
No.
It's like it's often a joke that's leveled at the queer community is the LGBTQ plus, and then like people just list off all the letters. It's like, like that. There's a lot of letters. But each of those letters is how someone is. Like that's someone's life. So like, what's the end of it? And I think it's the same with class, where like, we don't have to have this hard conception, because there's no hard conceptions of any other liberation area.
Absolutely.
Like race is the same, right? Where like you can be an anti-racist activist, and if someone asks you like, what does race mean, and really drills you in it, and goes like, if you're an anti-racist activist, does that just encompass everyone who's not white? Is it a Asian thing? What do you think? Does it include
people that are Irish and things like that?
And like you ask 100 people to define race, and you'll get 100 different answers. That doesn't mean that anti-racist activism in the UK now isn't incredibly powerful and incredibly important. And it's the same with
absolutely. This is what I keep trying to say. I've also been told as well, I mean, those boundaries are fuzzy around disability, because I have fibromyalgia, so it's not something that's visible. And there are people who have disabilities whose lives are curtailed to a far greater extent, and who will experience far greater discrimination than I ever will, but we still fall within a common group. And nobody kind of questions that. I'm allowed to self-identify as disabled on that basis. No one's quibbling about that. But with class, all of a sudden it's this big problem, and people are splitting hairs. So.
I'd be interested actually to talk to say like some older disability activists, like some people who were doing disability activism in the 60s and even like back in the 50s, like when you first started installing this idea of political disability, what was the opposition like? Is it the same kind of arguments we're seeing now? Because like like I've only ever understood it as someone who like works in disability activism, right? Is that like my mental health is legally a disability, right? But I am someone who presents in such a way that I have like privileges that I could use to help out the rest of people with disabilities in the UK. And like that's the thing, is that like I am privileged in such a way that I have easier access to political institutions and like public bodies and stuff like that. Like I can, because of the ableist way society is set up, my specific disability means that I can navigate that slightly easier. And there's been never any question that I should abandon the idea of disability activism to just like not be disabled anymore, just because I go on medication or something. And it should be the same with class. It's like, I am picking up tools as we go along, and you're the same. Where as we move and as we like develop as we grow and gain educations and get more involved in political institutions and like develop these like languages for talking about things that mean that we could probably, if we really wanted to, give it a good go at severing any idea that we're working class and just leave. But why should we like deny the person we've been for our entire lives just because of we have this one shot of being able to maybe ignore it if we're lucky? And I think it is interesting to look back at Britain's history, because in preparing for this interview, I had to look at what I would consider like working class cultural history, right? But the more you dug into it, the more you understood that working class cultural history is like basically the majority of Britain's cultural history. But when things are produced by the working class, they are immediately co-opted into Britain's national story. So, you know, at the moment, if you ask people on the street what sort of Britain's public icons would be in 2021, you'd see like a lot of people talking about, say, Marcus Rashford, Stormzy, and I'm trying to touch on with culture in the sense that I can't name a third person. But those are, you know, two working class lads.
Oh, is it Loki?
Yeah. Loki's fantastic. And yeah, most of Britain's cultural output is people who were or are working class, depending on how you look at it.
Yeah.
And that's always the case. And like even our like, you know, to bring it back to politics, our political wins is like, you know, when people talk about working class politics, we often define it around this hinge point of the miners' strike, which was a huge moment for working class politics in Britain. But also is, you know, only one of many. Like, you know, going back to, you know, universal education, the National Health Service, like public fire departments, like all of these campaigns were ones
and
that
the
were
poll tax.
The poll tax.
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. Suffrage was a majority working class move fundamentally, and they are wins that are co-opted into just like things that were inevitably going to happen anyway, and that you take that politics out of it, and you take that class consciousness out of it, and all of a sudden you look back and you see working class history and culture as nothing, because it's been moved into the sort of foundations of Britain essentially. I think it is like it's I don't know, really important to define a working class culture, but I still struggle with it. Like I couldn't tell you where the borders were, but that squash potential is huge.
Yeah, sociologists have kind of looked into working class culture, haven't they, and different sort of characteristics that are different between middle class and between working class families, and how children are spoken to, raised, what's valued, you know, like so how the middle class massively focus on education because there's this huge fear of their children dropping down the social order. Whereas, you know, it's less emphasized within working class families. Not that it doesn't matter, but that it's not fear driven in that sense. But I think a lot of those studies, I don't know, I think a lot of that kind of research and work, it's died a death. There used to be a lot more funding available for that kind of study, and it's interesting, it's informative, and it tells us a lot more about how society works. And how some of this is reinforced as well. One of the things that I've also come across is that sometimes campaigning to have recognition of class as an equality strand is seen as a threat to other equality strands. Like you can't have all of them. You know, you might displace the focus on sort of racism or sexism or some other area by including class in that. And I'm just wondering whether that's something that you've come across in terms of, you know, getting a working class officer established. Did that ever come up as a concern?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. It's the first go-to. It's like you get, the two big arguments are always class is irrelevant now, which you get from the right, and from like people who I would consider allies naturally would come back and go like, well, actually, we don't want to be reductive and pretend it's all about class. It's like, well, it's not all about class, but it's a bit about class. So, and I think, there's definitely what I'm really sad about, and what I spend most of my time really agonizing with, is the fact that, like, not even just the Labour Party, but the left in general, progressives in Britain have accepted the right-wing narrative that working class interests and the interests of people of colour or disabled people or queer people or women are fundamentally different, as if the working class isn't the biggest and most diverse class in the country. Like fundamentally, the majority, because of how racially unequal Britain is, the majority of people of colour will be working class, or will be disproportionately working class. Same for disabled people, same for trans people. You know, that these issues need to be considered together. And that's what real intersectionality is. Intersectionality isn't about, you know, developing these competing interests and trying to figure out who's the most oppressed. What intersectionality is basically a modern understanding of solidarity, which, you know, a word that we just don't hear anymore. And it, you know, what was really exciting, I think, about the Labour Party over the last 5 years, well, the Labour Party from 2015 to 2019, 2020, was, for all of its faults, you heard that language again of solidarity, and you started to hear that language of class creeping in, not as opposed to, say, immigration or Black Lives Matter, which is how it's used at the moment, is like, white working class interests are pitched against progress. But you heard that language of class as if it could be something constructive and productive, as if we could all build a common understanding of class and use it to make something better, just make anything better. Like so much of our activism is about, is
and
like
make it relevant as well, make it feel relevant, like it reflects everybody in society and not just, I mean, because if we've only got 3% or less of MPs within the party, within the Labour Party, that are from those manual routine working backgrounds or unemployed, but we're doing well on our race, gender, disability, all of our other statistics in terms of representation, which we are. We've got over 50% of our MPs are now women, which is brilliant. It's not for 1 minute suggesting we take the foot off the gas on that or on race or anything else. But what that tells us is that, okay, so the women and Black people, disabled people, whoever, that are MPs cannot possibly be from those manual routine work backgrounds. They must be from the middle class, and that has to be, it has to be a problem. But when I've sort of raised that, I want to basically take the Labour Party rule book and say, okay, we need rule changes here, 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 and here. The same way that we've threaded all of these other equalities issues through the rule book. So we've got, I think it's we've got Black Labour, and we've got we've got Labour Women Network, but we've also got Labour Women Leading, so they're like the left and right women's organisations, these socialist societies. Well, then we need to have a socialist society for people who are from working class backgrounds. We've got national and regional committees for each of those different equalities groups. We need one for working class people. We've got places on the NEC so that there's a direct input on policy and direction, and to raise those equalities issues at that kind of governance level. We need to have that place for, and branches at a local level in each of the different towns or CLPs, whatever. We need to have working class branches, same as we have women's branches or forums or whatever. And I'm kind of told by people that I really respect, and we share, politics are more or less identical in every other way. Just choose one of those, because if you try to do all of them, it'll just get knocked back. And that's within a socialist party that used to belong, or, in part belong to it used to be a political home for the working class. And one of the justifications is, if you mention the comparison between the underrepresentation of the working class next to how well we've done on sexuality, on race, on gender, and whatever else, then you are by default suggesting that we take the foot off the gas with those things, and it'll be seen as a threat. So it's just a real problem, because to me, that's a drawbridge mentality. It's not acceptable. It's not acceptable within socialism, to me.
No,
yeah.
I think, it's a response we got quite often, was that you don't need working class. Like this is again a very early foundations, where like the main goal of Britain as a class was to set out to put working class officers in all parts of public life, and that included the Labour Party and trade union movement. And you'd see like, oh well, the trade union movement is the movement of the working class. The Labour Party is the political home of the working class. You don't need working class representatives. Like you say, like most Labour MPs aren't working class. Most of Labour's bureaucracy aren't working class. Like working class politics and Labour politics have been very different things for a very long time. And I think there's a justifiable from other sort of liberation campaigns. There's a justifiable sort of knee-jerk kind of defensiveness, because that if you're I mean, for example, like Diane Abbott is the single most abused figure in politics, and it is almost purely for the fact that she is a Black woman. And you're seeing like women of color in the Labour Party just be lambasted publicly and like completely unsupported by their white colleagues, right? And I think people who have won those wins, like anti-racists who have won anti-racist wins, queer people who have won queer rights wins, disabled people who won disabled rights wins, like obviously are going to be very defensive about it, because they've had that constantly undermined. I think what is always going to be a developing conversation, it's always going to be evolving, is that as a working class movement we need to figure out this language of solidarity again. We need to understand not just how we reuse solidarity in our lives again, but also how we communicate it in a way that gets across, like, I am absolutely not trying to take anything away from you. I think we need to work together. Because the fundamental thing is that things in Britain are so bad that, you know, there is no reason for any of our interests to be competing, right? It is purely that there is a class of people who are majority not representative of, say, if you were talking to, like, if either of us were talking to a black activist in the Labour Party, like, you know, the people at the top of society who make my life harder and make your life harder are the same people.
Yeah.
And they are representative of you and they're not representative of me. And there's no reason that our causes can't work side by side, and they should. They always win when they do. But it is just, yeah, I think there's that problem of cynicism in politics and cynicism in media, especially, where, you know, the conception of the white working class to me is just absolutely, like, disgusting. Because there's not one working class.
No.
And that one working, if there was a one working class, it definitely wouldn't be a white one.
Yeah.
And
it's interesting because, like, the working class is a multicultural working class, and if it's about your relationship to power, you know, then that cuts across race, disability, you know, sexuality, gender, everything else, doesn't it? So class is a cross-cutting thing in terms of the other equalities groups, because it's about a person's relationship to power and how much voice they've got, how seriously they're taken, how open opportunities really are to them, and a whole series of different sort of oppressions. Some of them are more visible than others, you know, some of them are more subtle than others. But I think that, you know, black activists have some advantage in the sense that they are more self-aware of the oppressions that they face, and they've got this history now of being able to sort of group together and achieve a level of legal protection in the same way that women have. You know, so there's recognition in the law and amongst us, you know, as women, that these oppressions apply, and we're angry about them, and we can fight about them. We have a language for them. We have communities, you know, activist communities around those issues. Whereas with the working class, that language, that fight, it's dissipated. So, you know, for example, with COVID, if you read sort of a Public Health England report, it says that, you know, predominantly the impact has been on people who are from those lower socioeconomic groups. We know that people who are black minority ethnic are disproportionately represented within those lower socioeconomic groups. But it's, you know, it's a mixed, it's sort of a multicultural working class that have been dying at twice the rate or over twice the rate of sort of the middle class and the more affluent people, you know, for a variety of reasons, but the reasons are class-based primarily. But that is something that people should be angry about, I feel. But because we don't have this discourse around class, it's just, it's disappeared off of the public discourse. Yeah.
I think it's important to remember where that comes from, is that, you know, like, not to say that the working class movement has been able to rest on its laurels a bit, but there's always been this conception that the Labour Party and the trade union movement are representing our interests. And, you know, the Labour Party and the trade union movement have historically been almost consistently incredibly racist and incredibly sexist, right? So if you're a black activist who wants like a full, like, political movement, like a full body political movement for the rights of black people to, even, like, I mean, that's the thing, like, the fact that, like, the Black Lives Matter is such a relevant movement means that, you know, the right you're fighting for is the ability of black people to just live, you know, unmolested, right? The fact that has to exist is heartbreaking, but that it does, and that it does so effectively, especially it is doing so effectively compared to working class movements, is not that those issues are of different importance. It's not that they compete in terms of importance and one of them is more important than the other. It's that black activists have historically known that they do not have a permanent home in the trade union movement. So they've had to create their own networks, their own organizations. Whereas I think that's where we have been weak as a movement, working class activists, right? Is that we have, especially, I saw it especially under Corbyn, and in 2019, like in the December election, I just saw myself as well, myself and just all of the working class activists I knew just spiraled, because like we thought we were going to get a win, we didn't, and then we didn't know what to do.
Yeah.
And I think that was a really short, sharp microcosm of what's been happening in class politics for a while, is that you can kind of assume that the trade union movement and the Labour Party have your back, even though, it's not a new thing for the Labour Party to not be interested in working class interests. It's been a struggle to get them to do anything progressive on class. That was founded fundamentally. The trade union movement, especially since the Lobbying Act, but going all the way back to the 80s, where they would the union movement had just been hammered to the point where now all it is, despite the fantastic work of trade unionists across the country, is primarily an insurance scheme for your job. Because their ability to be political has been massively undermined. And that was always our safety net as a class movement, is that you could assume if you're a working class person, your union has your back. There is power in union. But what happens when there isn't power in a union? Whereas it's not that they're lucky, it's that black activists and feminists and disability activists have always assumed that they are of the union movement, and the Labour Party will either be uninterested or actively opposed to them. For good reason. And I think that's why they have these robust movements that can react in the way that they do. Whereas, it almost feels like we're still at an infancy stage of a modern working class movement, which I think why people are so angry at each other all the time, even though we're all on the same side.
Well, I think we're encouraged to be, I don't think it's accidental. It's the whole divide and rule thing, isn't it? But also there's been I agree with you. I think that if that support hasn't been there for women, and it hasn't been there for people black and minority ethnic backgrounds, then they've had to create their own structures and their own fights, and we haven't had to perhaps so much on a class basis, but there was also a systematic dismantling of working class representation through the Blair era. So, affluent candidates were parachuted into working class areas. It's something that Lisa McKenzie was talking about when she was on. And it's just severed that sense of belonging and that sense of having a place and being valued. Of
course. Well, I never actually knew I don't actually know if she ever said this, but it's that famous thing of Thatcher saying that Blair was her greatest victory, which I think she did. But it is just, there has been even though there's been different Labour and Tory governments since the 80s, there has been one economic system, and that economic system has always been upheld. They have always, every government since 1980, every government since, either of us have been alive, has only been interested in the management of modern international capitalism. So there's no interest in working class representation, because working class representation is a fundamental obstacle to that, right?
It's the main thing that's going to threaten capitalism, isn't it? Yeah.
You saw it with the only real ground shaking win I can remember in the last couple of years for the trade union movement, because there's been some the Trade Union Congress did a fantastic job getting everyone who was furloughed paid, or get everyone the option of being furloughed. But not even everyone, just create the option of being furloughed, essentially. It's a win, but that is not a win that fundamentally challenges the system.
No.
The only thing you're seeing that is challenging the system is these smaller, really reactive unions like UVW, IWGB, who are getting, it was like when they made Deliveroo recognise their drivers as employees and stuff like that. That's what threatens the profit motive, right? And that's why working class activism will never be allowed to mature in some of these big systems, because there's just too much momentum against them. Because there's too much protection of the fact that I don't know if anyone's actually ever done this, but I've always been meaning to dig through Labour MPs' interests and find out who is and isn't a landlord, because I would bet that it's the majority of them. Stuff like that, where our representatives themselves are unrepresentative of working class people, and they're probably the most representative part of it. Once you get into the bureaucracies, once you get into the Labour Party as an institution, and then once you go past that into the civil service, into the media, into even actually the trade union movement, you're seeing people who are by and large increasingly not from working class backgrounds. It feels like we're starting again, which is
it does.
But, we get a lot of freedom to kind of do what we want.
Do what you like. Well, so with Britain Has Class, what's your focus at the moment, and how is it now? Are people more accepting? Is it, do you think, around that movement? Have you managed to change some minds as to the fact that it's needed?
Yeah, I think we had a really interesting year in the sense that we had to basically shut down for coronavirus. I mean, we were an organisation that was already struggling with our capacity. We were founded by a group of students who all went on and graduated and then got jobs, and now just don't have the time and still don't have the money to run this as fully as we'd like to. And I think that will always be the case. That's always the case for class activism. It's just always a thing you have to do on the side of the thing that means you get to live.
Yeah.
But coronavirus just shut us down entirely. So, like people had to take on second jobs, people had caring responsibilities, people had mental health crises, like just everyone individually had something that stopped them from being able to do this. So we just closed for a year, we just closed shop. And we started up again. And what we're seeing is almost like we don't have to have that first conversation anymore, which is nice.
Yeah.
Like we don't have to have the why does class matter, because we've just had, for horrible reasons, because we've just had a pandemic that has killed people who are majority working class.
Yeah. So on the question of kind of racism and, I don't know, working class political homelessness, from your perspective, is there a link between those two? And if so, is something like the Northern Independence Party a potential answer to that, or along closer lines to what's needed? Or
I think so. I really have a lot of time for the Northern Independence Party, despite being a dirty Southerner. I still think I think the left never learned its lessons from UKIP, because I think there's a lot to learn from that, in terms of like you don't give in at all to those narratives of anti-immigration or to like regressive English nationalism, or even really to just regular English nationalism, in my opinion. What you learn is that the reason that UKIP were able to move the Tory party so far right, and therefore move Britain's politics so far right, is that they really materially threatened their seats. And that was it. And the problem is with the Greens and with like all of the other like independent left-wing parties to the left of Labour, partly the Greens were, they have a spotty record on being left-wing anyway. But everyone else, there was never a material threat that you were going to steal Labour seats, because every time you do that, you always get the response of like, well, people need a Labour government because the Labour government is the only thing stopping like desperate poverty. And because left-wing people are fundamentally driven by wanting to do good, that hits harder than someone in UKIP worrying about whether the Tories are going to win. But in the long term, it just means that you keep losing, because you're always compromising with a system that hates you. So I think what the Northern Independence Party can do, I mean, if the Northern Independence Party take enough of the Labour vote that they lose Hartlepool, then good. Labour don't have enough, like the Tories have a massive lead anyway. There's nothing they need to worry about in terms of like Labour actually ever stopping them from doing anything. And Labour have shown that under the current leadership, they're not interested in really stopping from doing anything. So it won't affect the actual like, lives of people in this country if Labour lose Hartlepool. What it shows is that like left-wing people have somewhere else to go.
There's a potential fight back.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that swings people. And in terms of like electoral politics, we need to demonstrate to the Labour Party, if you're not going to put forward working class interests, if you're not going to take seriously the fact that classism needs addressing in this country, then we'll vote somewhere else. And you can't rely on, the Labour Party has a real history of just assuming that certain parts of its electorate are never going to go anywhere. Even in the last 10 years, it lost the entirety of Scotland and then almost the entirety of the North. There's for some reason this thought in the Labour Party that, we're not going to lose young people, or we're not going to lose the cities. But like what, like the reasoning for not losing young people or the cities is like they have nowhere else to go. And that was the same reasoning for thinking that the North wouldn't go. The same reason for thinking that Scotland wouldn't go. And then all of a sudden, someone else came along with, an offer, and people took it. And it's going to happen again in central London. Someone might come up and just say like, hey, do you want to not live in a tiny polluted box all the time? And like Labour aren't offering you that. So I think the Northern Independence Parties are really exciting. But even if they don't win, I think they're miles away from winning a seat. But UKIP never actually won a seat in an election, and they defined British politics for the last 10 years. So I think it's really exciting. To the relationship between political homelessness and racism, I think it definitely plays a part. Like there's always been the sort of difference between structural racism in Britain, which is constructed and purposeful and operates on a level that none of us can really see, and just like day-to-day far-right street level activism. And that structural racism is always going to be beyond the individual reaches of working class communities. That needs real national structural change. And that's the thing that, I think it's above even Tommy Robinson's radar, is like not being able to approach this and change this. What Tommy Robinson obviously specializes in is whipping up disenfranchised and bored and angry young men into doing stupid stuff.
It's interesting you say young men as well, because I was thinking about this morning, because my friend lives in like a block of flats in Brixton, and she's lived there for years, decades. And she said that there is this kind of casualized low-level racism, in the use of language and things like that. People will say things that within the Labour Party, the middle-class Labour Party, people would be really shocked by, and they'd be really reactive against, and it is unacceptable. But she said on a practical level, and this was really interesting to me, she said the mums, the women, all look after each other's kids. It's very multicultural, it's very integrated in that sense, across the women. And I wondered about this whole idea of racism and masculinity, and people's concept of having their masculinity eroded, and how that plays into racism. It seems as if it's more of a working class male issue than a working class female issue. I don't know if that's a really unfair thing to say, but just
I don't think so. I think if you look, especially, I think obviously this is said with the caveat that everyone has the capacity to be a massive racist.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, I think if you look, you just have to look at any EDL march, any Democratic Football Lads Alliance or whatever march, any sort of racist protest, or like the backlash to the BLM protests in the summer, any sort of street level representation of angry racism, vast majority men. And that's what, it's always interesting that these are that's the thing that's always missed, is that whenever you see a street level far right activity, it's always reported as a working class thing. And it's never said that, like, actually, while a lot of the people on those protests are working class, and we should explore that, and also as working class communities, we should take responsibility for that, and in educating our young men away from this reality where they convince themselves that it is the right thing to do to go out and terrorize like black and minority ethnic communities. Well, we need to take responsibility for that as working class communities. What we don't talk about is that there's probably a greater proportion of men on those marches than working class people. And why don't we explore the relationship between, masculinity and violence?
Yeah, it would be good not to excuse, obviously, but just to understand what's going on with that, because there's some reason why that's happening, and why it's not the women, so.
Well, one of the really interesting things that came out of Loss on the Terraces, which is this report I did into the death of football in towns and what that would mean for working class identity and for community resilience. And by community resilience, we meant a resilience to change, both in, like, if you get a large surge of immigration, how comfortable is that? How well is that taken? And also, if you get far right agitators in trying to stir up people, how roundly and resolutely can the community tell them to fuck off, right? And community resilience is undermined the fewer community assets you have, obviously. But what football represented was one of the last sort of chest-beating community experiences. Like one of the last, I don't think it's a healthy expression of masculinity, but like one of the last expressions of masculinity.
It's like tribal.
In communities that are fundamentally, like, you are, if you're looking at someone who's been told that you're a macho breadwinner, and actually you don't work manual labor anymore, you are probably out of shape, because everyone's out of shape, especially after the last year we've had. You aren't even the breadwinner, and you just don't really have anything from that traditional conception of masculinity, even though it's been put into your head. That's where you start to get that sense of sort of loss and fear and confusion. And it's, we obviously need to be teaching our boys other things. We need to be teaching our boys masculinity, especially traditional masculinity, is stupid and poisonous and ridiculous, and just makes you look silly. But there's also a lot of people who are already indoctrinated into the idea that you have to be a physically, like, powerful and violent presence. And that's what Tommy Robinson offers, is like, you've been this, it's across the Western world, is this idea that, like, white men have somehow been emasculated and we need to protect against the invader. And it's just stupid. And it's a thing that needs confronting as a myth on its own, but in practical terms, it's a thing that gets hold faster in young men who live in places where they have no community
Where they've
expression.
got nothing and they've lost, lost their cultural foothold or a
It's like,
sense of place.
Who knows that better than anywhere else? Where Tommy Robinson's a Lutonian. He like founded the EDL here. The reason it started off here is that there was really nothing to do. Like, I love Luton. I am a Lutonian through and through. I love the town. But if you ask me to define what being a Lutonian is beyond just being literally physically in Luton, I can't tell you. Like, we've lost all our youth centres. Especially at the time that the EDL was founded, the football club had been demoted to non-league. It was under threat of just disappearing entirely. There's all those losses of identity
that correlate.
And that obviously doesn't excuse people from joining being active in these movements. But if we're looking in practical terms at stopping people from being suckered in by the far right, you need to give them hope. You need to give them
I think we have to look at masculinity and sense of place and belonging and what men need. And masculinity itself, to me, that's not the problem. It's the toxic aspect of it and the sense of loss and fear and shame and those kind of things that you've mentioned. And one of the projects I used to manage was a domestic abuse project, and I think it's important that we understand and we dig into these issues of toxic masculinity because we have to, in order to understand why these things are happening. It's not a way of excusing them, but it's kind of very blinkered to assume that you can tackle these issues without doing the work of digging down into understanding what's at the root of them. There may be really big uncomfortable things that are revealed about our culture, our wider culture, that would need to be tackled, or that we could experiment with tackling. Not to ban masculinity, but just to look at how toxic masculinity is encouraged and what the potential impacts of that might be, in terms of domestic abuse, in terms of racism and all of those things. But certainly an empowered working class that will fight for its place, that would be a healthier fight, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. I think it is, they need to come up as conversations together, is that there needs to be a robust, confident working class movement. But that working class movement must be representative of the working class, of the disproportionately immigrant and people of colour and female and disabled.
All of us. And the ways that some parts of the working class hurt other parts of the working class, for me, predominantly through the mechanism of capitalism and the damage that's done to working class people. We're a multicultural, male, female, and everything in between working class, and we need to start operating and thinking as one. I think. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the fact that we're in this stage of trying to rebuild a working class movement means that we can inject that kind of understanding, and we can make it a movement that is comfortable with uncomfortable conversation. So to bring us back to what we were talking about earlier with the sort of borders of class between working class and middle class, what I saw a lot of when I was starting out as a working class activist, and what you still see a lot of, is while I think it's important, like you say, to understand the difference between working class life and middle class life, and how that means that, like, basically, if you're working class, you live harder, shorter lives that are rubbed against the system more abrasively. But there was a tendency in working class activism, I still think there is, to assume that anyone who's bringing up another liberation issue, whether it be racism, disability, gender, especially gender and sexuality was the ones I saw, was when people were talking about feminism or queer rights in working class spaces and were making people uncomfortable, the shrug off would be like, oh, well, they're just middle class anyway. And like, importantly, like, making sure that our movement is able to have those uncomfortable conversations and talk about how we hold different levels of privilege and how we work within that. I think is really, really important. And I think it's something we can do. It's definitely within the power.
I think mothers would be good at that, because as mothers we have sons who are black, or they're mixed race, or they're gay, or they're not sure what they're, and daughters as well, going through it, we, might have a disability or whatever. As mothers, that empathy, as working class mothers, that empathy could be drawn on, couldn't it? And probably fathers too, so
I think there is something in that. There's like a lack of study, I think, in like the matriarchal way that working class families can work. Is that I saw a stand up the other day, and I can't remember who she was, but she was talking about feminism. She said, like, feminism's fantastic, but it took me a while to get my head around, because I'm from the north and I'm working class, and in working class families, women, just in charge.
Yeah.
And that was
That's so funny.
And I think like understanding a sort of proud matriarchal working class as a way of moving forward is really
that could be positive.
Yeah,
definitely. It's interesting. Lisa Mackenzie's hit on that as well, about the women, working class women and miners' wives, that they've been portrayed as meek and following in the footsteps and doing things in the kitchen to support but they were actually spearheading it, telling the men, go on, out. You're on strike, out you get. And
every progressive movement, we remember those iconic photos of the line between the miners and the police, or on Brick Lane, like the fascists and the anti-fascists. And because of just the toxic way masculinity works, usually the people charging in to hurt other people are men. So that when we take those striking photos from history, we look at it and go like, oh yeah, look at men doing all this stuff. But really, most of those movements were driven fundamentally by women. I think that's a thing we need to recognise for our class. And I understand, like, being a male founder of a working class organisation, we have some conversations to have in Britain class about that. But I think that's the way forward fundamentally is the answer to toxic masculinity lies in matriarchy in a lot of ways. That's just me being a mummy's boy, I think.
Well, I have loved this conversation, and thanks for taking the time to have this conversation, and thanks for all the work that you do. You're an amazing activist. I really can't get my head around the amount of things amazing things that you're involved in. So we'll have to get back together again in the future. But if you have any links or anything that you would like to pass on to us for the Working Class Activist Network site, then send them, any pieces of literature or links to your work, your book, or whatever else. That would be really cool.
I mean, you can find everything we do at BritainSGlass.org, and everything just sort of stems out from that. But thanks so much for having us. This has been really, really wonderful.
Fab.
I'll be back before long.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thanks, Chris.